Good day everyone. Today we will be discussing some subtopics of the chapter 4. So the subtopics includes the bank and building societies, property companies in the stock market, real estate investment trust, overseas investors, private individuals, joint ventures partners, and the government assistance. So first, we will be discussing the bank and building societies. Banks who participate in the funding of development include both UK and the foreign clearing and merchant banks. So during the 1980s, banks became the dominant suppliers of development finance as UK banks competed with the foreign banks to fill the gap left by the financial institution as they reduced their exposure to property. So the bank extended their traditional role as the short-term finances and became involved in medium-term loans, usually up to 5 years beyond the completion of the development, in order to coincide with their first rent review. So they were encouraged by the dramatic growth in capital and rental values of property in the late 1980s property boom. During this time, banks were also joined by some of the larger building societies, traditionally residential mortgage providers, although only on smaller schemes. So during a particular period, banks were not the only entities involved in the financing mortgage schemes. So larger building societies, which typically focus on the providing residential mortgage, also participated in the funding projects, although primarily on a smaller scale initiatives. So to suggest that a diversification of the mortgage financing landscape, with building societies expanding their involvement beyond traditional residential mortgage to include smaller schemes. Immediately following the last major property crash in the 90s, most banks concentrated on reducing their debts outstanding to property companies and were understandably cautious before forwarding larger sums on the hypothetical property development. So following this crash, many property developments remain unlet or unsold for the extended period, although eventually they were sold at a loss and declared as a bad debt, or there was a delay until the market picked up again. So since this period, the area of property development has once again re-established trust among lenders, who are also conduct due diligence on the property before the advancing funds. The banks now adopt a hands-on approach to understanding the property development industry and are assisted by their own valuation surveyors and research teams. So banks have shifted towards actively engaging with and understanding the property development industry. They are now more directly involved, using their own teams of valuation surveyors and the research specialists to assess property values and the market trends. So this hand approach indicates a deeper level of involvement and commitment from the banks in the property development sectors. The banks are less likely to lend on purely speculative developments without the provision of a sound business case with a comprehensive and industry-supported market data and projections. So which means that they place substantial emphasis upon lending on a prime low-risk development that are predominantly pre-let. If the agreed proportion in the development cannot be pre-let or pre-sold, often the development is reconfigured to meet market demand. Example, modify the quality of development. So it must be noted that the banks are in business to make a direct financial gain from lending money, where lending to property companies has always been viewed as profitable, although subject to market downturns. Bank lending may take the form of corporate lending to a company by means of overdraft facilities or short-term loans. Bank lending can involve providing financial support directly to companies and rather than individuals. This support often comes in the form of corporate loans, which could be in the form of overdraft facilities or short-term loans. So these loans helps companies manage their cash flow, finance their operations, or fund specific project on a temporary basis. A loan may be made to enable a specific development project to proceed or for a developer to retain a development as an investment. So to reduce the exposure to risk, The banks will use the development or the investment property and or the asset of the company as security for loans. Property is attractive as security for banks as it is a large identifiable asset with a resale value. But importantly, it cannot be sold unless it has a clear unencumbered title of ownership. However, due to the cyclical nature of property markets, there will be always periods where property values will decrease. The bank's willingness to lend money to developers is determined by their confidence in the property market and the underlying economy at any particular time. So the bank's willingness to lend money to developer depends on their confidence in the property market and the overall economy. So if they believe that both are stable and growing, they are more likely to offer loans. The clearing banks, due to their large deposit base, are the major providers of corporate finance loans to development and property companies. So clearing banks, due to their substantial deposit base, are the primary sources of the corporate finance loan for development and property companies offering significant funding for a project. The merchant banks, with some being subsidiaries of clearing banks and specialist property lenders, have smaller funds but they have more property expertise. They are more inclined to provide project loans and because of their expertise, will take on high-risk loans in return for an equity stake in a project. So the merchant banks, often subsidiaries of clearing banks and specialized property lenders, have smaller funds but greater expertise in a property. They prefer providing project loans and may take on higher risk loans in exchange for an equity stake in a project due to their knowledge and experience in the field. Merchant banks on a large development projects may assume the role of the lead bank and assemble syndicate of banks to provide finance, and in doing so, many underwrite the loan. Merchant banks also undertake investment management on behalf of institutional investors through investment funds and the unit trust. Since the 1986 Building Societies Act have been allowed to provide corporate loans secured on the commercial rented property, provided such loan comprise a relative small proportion of the total loans. So in the past, some building societies have been exposed to risk due to the ups and downs in the property cycles, particularly with the residential developers, and as such have withdrawn from development funding, although other societies have still been willing to fund commercial property investment. So they restrict themselves to smaller loans and tend to be less competitive than banks in relation to the interest rates they charge, although this varies between different societies and banks. When lending money, the lender's main task is to assess their exposure to risk, based primarily on the possibility that the borrower will not be able to meet agreed regular payments, will not be able to pay back any money, and or what the minimum amount is that the property could be sold for. So when lending money, the lender's main concern is evaluating the risk they face. This involves assessing the likelihood that borrowers may not be make regular payments, may default on the loan entirely, or that the property used as collateral may have a minimum resale value. The bank's criteria for making loans will vary depending on many unique factors, including the nature and size of the development company, the nature and size of the development, the length of the loan, and the strength of the security being offered. So the criteria of bank used for lending varies based on the factors such as the size and the nature of the development company and the project itself, the loan duration, and the strength of the collateral provided. The banks have always tended to take a short-term view in relation to their lending policies, being concerned primarily with the underlying value of the development company and or development project. So as a result, there was a widespread criticism of the bank's lending policies during the 1980s, with many partly laying the blame for the booms or slump at their door. One argument was that the bank relied too heavily on security and did not pay enough attention to assessing the risk attached to both borrowers and projects. On the other hand, the banks were quick to blame the values whose opinion formed the basis for assessing loans, evidenced by the many negligence cases pending against valuers. Property loans usually account for a relatively small proportion, approximately 10% of all commercial lendings by the banks, and merchant banks are also conscious of their exposure to property. So after the last boom or bust cycle in the 1990s, many development companies were in default in relation to the condition of both their corporate and the project loans, as the value of their development or properties were less than their outstanding debts. So in order to reduce the losses to their investments, banks were willing to restructure many loans by a combination of the measures such as renegotiating loan terms, refinancing loans, swapping debts for equity, converting part of the debt into mortgage, and also forcing sales of assets in a worst-case scenarios. Traders, developers were particularly vulnerable, and of those who remained, many were being tightly controlled by their banks. Traders, developers face significant vulnerability, with many being closely monitored and controlled by their banks for financial stability. In a depressed market, where the banks decided to stand by to support a developer or project, the problem of vacant or over-rented property due to the excess supply situation remains. So in downturn, if bank chose to support a developer or project, there's still a challenge of vacant or over-rented property due to the excess supply despite the bank intervention. The banks often have to make major write-downs after a downturn and are increasingly reluctant to be exposed to this type of risk, and the banks have also developed a flexible range of different financing products in order to meet the changing demands of the market and in response to increasingly competitive financing environment. So the banks frequently incur substantial losses during economic downturns and are hesitant to take on such risk. So to adapt to market demands and competition, banks have diversified their financing products to offer more flexibility. And now, let's proceed to property companies and the stock market. There are two broad categories of companies who participate in development: the investor and traders. The investor type of company, usually referred to as a property company, is also a source of long-term finance, as some purchase property investment for their portfolio as well as retaining their own developments. So their capacity to purchase property depends largely on their ability to raise finance. Property companies and the development companies alike are partly financed by their own capital and that of their shareholders, and partly financed by borrowed money, either short-term or long-term. The level of gearing or the relationship between borrowed money and the company's own money will vary between the companies. So property companies, as opposed to the trader development companies, tend to have a lower level of gearing due to the strength of their assets base. Property companies vary from small private firms to large publicly quoted companies. Some specialize in a particular geographical location, such as a quadrant in a city, while others hold large portfolios on a cross-section of property types in both UK and overseas. Their prime objectives is to make a direct profit from their investment and develop activities, while some will take a longer-term view than others to the extent to which they trade on their investment and completed development. They always have a responsibility to their shareholders to increase shareholders' wealth by maintaining the share price and providing dividends. So companies have a duty to their shareholders to enhance shareholders' wealth by sustaining share prices and issuing dividends regularly. Property companies view property investment as both a source of income and as an asset providing security for borrowed money. Property firms see property investment as generating income and offering collateral for loans. Property companies, particularly the large quoted ones, will tend to concentrate their investment activities on prime and good secondary properties. Largely, property companies especially their publicly traded, focus their investment efforts on prime and high-quality secondary properties. However, unlike the institution, they see the management aspect of property investment as an advantage. They both the management and the development skills in-house to improve the value of properties. Also, they are not adverse to multi-let properties provided they are in a good location and of a high quality. They may purchase investment properties with redevelopment potential that are not fully let or are nearing the end of the lease. The shareholders of property companies are a combination of financial institutions and private individuals. Financial institutions invest in a property company shares instead of or in addition to their direct property investment. However, it is not tax efficient for pension funds who are non-taxpayers to invest in a property company shares where compared with investing in property directly. This is because corporation tax is paid on a company's profit before dividends on the shares are paid, and capital gains tax is paid on a property sales. Tax-paying shareholders will be taxed on the dividends and on any capital gains from selling the shares. With quoted property investment company, the shares are valued by the stock market below the value of the asset of the company attributable to the shares. This is known as NAV, or the net asset value per share. So the net asset value, this discount to asset value is due to the tax disadvantage of the company, as capital gains tax might be payable on the sale of their assets. So the amount to which shares are discounted varies with the stock market condition and the state of the property market. However, the value of the property company shares fluctuates more widely than the value of the property regardless of the state of the property market. Equity finance can be raised by issuing various forms of shares in a company, with investors directly participating in the profits and risk of the company. So equity finance involves raising capital by issuing shares in a company, allowing investors to directly shares in a profit and risk. New property companies may float on the stock market and raise money by selling shares, often referred to as an IPO or the initial purchase offerings. New property companies often go public through an IPO, selling shares to raise funds from investors. Quoted companies can issue new ordinary shares or preference shares to raise equity finance for their development activities, depending on stock market conditions, the overall performance of a property company shares, the NAV per share of a particular company. So quoted companies can issue ordinary or preference shares to raise equity finance for development activities depending on the market conditions and the company's performance measured by NAV per share. Long-term debt finance is capital borrowed from investors that usually involves fixed interest and may be secured in the company or unsecured. So long-term debt finance involve borrowing capital from investors, typically with fixed interest rates, and may be secured or unsecured. Debt finance instrument became popular as an alternative means of providing long-term finance to hold development as investments. So the debt finance instruments are increasingly used to finance long-term investments, providing an alternative to equity finance for property development projects. And now, let's proceed to real estate investment trust. Real estate investment trusts, commonly referred to as REITs, have been a successful vehicle for the securitization of property or real estate in many countries including the US, Australia, and Singapore. The increased popularity of REITs is linked to many advantages, including taxation incentives, availability of up-to-date information about the REIT, and being trading in the central stock market. REITs were introduced into the UK on 1st January 2007 in accordance with the Finance Act 2006. The UK REIT has many of the benefits of other REITs, including greater flexibility and liquidity. This investment vehicle offers several advantages such as greater flexibility and liquidity, similar to REITs in other countries. Essentially, UK REITs allow investors to access real estate assets through a publicly traded entity, providing opportunities for diversification and potentially higher returns compared to the direct property ownership. The requirements to qualify for a UK REIT are as follows. So first, it should be a UK tax resident and not a dual citizen. Second, listed on a recognized tax exchange. Third, not an open-minded investment company. Fourth, the only classes of shares allowed are ordinary shares and one class only, and non-participating preference shares. Fifth is distributes 90% of its net taxable profits, not capital gains, during the relevant accounting period or within 12 months of its end. Sixth, derives at least 75% of its total profit from tax-exempt property letting business. Seventh, at least 75% of the total value of asset held by the REIT must be held for tax-exempt property letting business. And lastly, conditions also apply KPMG on 2007. So, the REIT has been a widely accepted vehicle for funding a property by listing on a stock market. There are limitations that should be acknowledged. And now, let's proceed to the overseas investors. Due to the widespread effects of globalization and assisted by advances in information transfer including the internet, overseas investors have become significant participants in the property investment market. No longer is demand for property limited to prospective purchasers' geographic location, so it is commonplace for overseas investors to be just as fluent with the property market across the other side of the world as with their own local market. So demand for property is no longer limited by geography. Overseas investors are as familiar with the distant property market as with local ones. The source of overseas investment has varied since 1988. The Japanese and the Scandinavians lead the way during the boom period between 1987 and 1990. Since 1988, the source of overseas investment has changed, with Japanese and Scandinavian investors leading during the late 1980s boom. The government's favorable treatment of foreign investments together with the lifting of the Japanese government's restrictions provided the impetus for Japanese investors, developers, and contractors. The UK government's favorable policies on Japan lifting restriction spurred Japanese investors, developers, and the contractors. Global investors have not been restricted from any one particular country, and this trend in many ways mirrors the explosion of information transfer and availability primarily due to the internet. Global investors aren't limited to any one country, a trend reflecting the internet's role in facilitating information exchange. Expanding the market to overseas investors also has other benefits, and this includes increasing the number of prospective purchasers by enlarging the marketplace, increasing the potential borrowing capacity of the purchaser as opposed to the lenders in the local market, and ensuring the development is perceived as truly international. Attracting overseas investors expand the market, increases potential purchasers and borrowing capacity, and enhances the perception of development as truly international. And now, let's proceed to the private individuals. The majority of private individuals purchase property investment at the lower end of the market, with a large proportion being mom and dad investors who are borrowing against the equity on their principal place of residence in the form of a family home. Most private individuals invest in properties at the lower end of the market, often leveraging equity from their primary residence, becoming mom and dad investors. Private individuals are attracted to high-yielding properties as income will very often be in excess of interest rates. Private individuals are drawn to high-yielding properties where rental income exceeds interest rates, offering a steady income streams. So many private investors will often focus too much on the relationship between return and capital outlay and make a direct but false comparison with the return from a standard bank deposit. So some private investors may overly focus on comparing returns on initial investment, erroneously equating property investment returns with those of standard bank deposits. And now, let's proceed to joint ventures partners. A development company may raise finance or secure the acquisition of land by forming a partnership or a joint ventures company with a third party to carry out a specific development or a whole series of development projects. So the basic principles behind forming a partnership from the developer's point of view is to secure either finance or land. in return for a share in the profits of the development scheme or the joint ventures company. The joint share given to the third party will depend largely on the value of their contribution combined with the extent they wish to participate in the risk of the scheme. So, the portion of shares allocated to a third party in a joint venture is determined primarily by two factors. First is the value of their contribution to the venture, and second is their willingness to take on the associated risk of the project. So, the more significant their contribution and the higher their willingness to bear risk, the larger their share of the venture will likely be. This approach ensures a fair distribution of ownership and risk among all parties involved in the joint venture. A partnership may involve any combination of sharing the risk and reward of a scheme by many different contractual and company arrangements. So partnership can take various forms where parties share risk and reward through different contractual and company arrangement. A joint venture may also take many forms, but in a purest form that the parties participate in the development and distribute the profits in equal share, usually by forming a joint company. So joint ventures can also vary, but in its basic form, parties participate in the development and distribute profits equally, often by establishing a joint company. Tax and financial consideration may determine to a large extent the formal structure of the partnership arrangement. So tax and financial factors often influence the formal structure of partnership arrangement. Developers are typically reluctant to share profits with the third parties unless it is the only way of securing a particular site or finance for a development scheme. So developers usually prefer not to share profits with the third parties unless necessary to secure a site or finance for a project. Partnership with landowners may be required if the landowner wishes to participate in the profits of the development scheme or wishes to retain a long-term legal interest in the property, preferring income to a one-off capital receipt. So regardless of the reason for forming a partnership to finance a scheme, it is essential for the developers to ensure the definitions of the profit is clearly detailed and understood. In the case of a joint venture company, the profit will be distributed through the company account. A developer must rehearse every possible outcome of the scheme to ensure that any partnership arrangement will work and the true intentions of the parties have been carefully documented by all involved. And now, let's proceed to the government assistance. Any given time, there are different government grants available, largely dependent on available funding and the perceived ability of government assistance to be a catalyst for change. So, the government allocates a certain amount of money for grants. The availability of grants depends on the budget allocated for this. So the government offers grants with the intention of catalyzing or initiating positive changes in a specific areas such as economic development, social welfare, or environmental conservation. So the effectiveness of this grant is bringing about desired changes influences their availability. Many of these projects are designed to encourage private developers to proceed with a proposal, such as renewal or gentrification of an older building or a geographical area. So, this means that many government grant projects are specifically tailored to incentivize private developers to engage in initiatives aimed at renewing or gentrifying older buildings or geographical areas. These projects aims to improve the quality of life, enhance economic activity, and revitalize communities by leveraging the resources and expertise of the private sectors, supported by the government funding and incentives. The financial incentives would not be sufficient for the developers to undertake a viable project, although the government acknowledges there would be the wider community benefits if a developer would proceed with the project. So, the financial incentives provided by the government to a developer are not enough to make the project financially viable. But however, the government recognized that if the developer were to proceed with the project, there would be broader benefits for the community. So, the financial incentives provided by the government may not fully cover costs or risk associated with the project for the developers. The government believes that the broader benefits to the community justify its support for the project. That was the end of my discussion. I hope you learned something and thank you for listening.